Cool. So what we'll do is we'll just simply Google for Docker install Ubuntu 16.04. Now here's the official Docker documentation. It's the first link. So we'll click on it. And if you go down, this is where the command starts. These are all the commands that you have to run. Now, because we are doing it for the first time, I will kind of explain what are what exactly are these commands doing. So the first command here is actually removing any existing Docker. Now the Docker folks understand that a lot of people that are trying Docker have no idea what Docker is. So if they had tried to install some Docker somewhere before, like if you're new to Linux and if you saw this message, you would obviously think I just need to run apt install docker.io, right? But then you come across this documentation to install Docker and you directly start running the command. So as a precaution, these guys are making you remove any existing Docker version that you might have before they actually show you how to install it. So that's what the first command does. It removes any existing Docker version. Now I don't really need to run that because I know I don't have a Docker. Then here comes the installation part. So the first command you have to run is apt-get update. So we'll run that. The second command you have to run is you need to install some prerequisites because this is what Docker is dependent on. So we'll go ahead and run these. Now these are more of the Linux prerequisites, like almost all the tools will require them. It's not very specific to Docker. Okay, once that is done, it's asking us to add the GPG key. I think I talked about GPG key as well, right? What are the SHA-256 keys and all of that. So once that is done, it's asking me to just verify the fingerprint. We will do that. So even though I'm simply copy pasting the command, I know for a fact what exactly is happening. So if one of those commands were not to work, I would know exactly why are they not working. So while it's not a problem to simply copy paste the commands, it also helps if you just read the command. Now let's say you are reading the command and you don't know what is this. What do you mean by add apt repository? All it takes is a Google search. And this will basically tell you, now this gives me a clear idea as add app repository is adding an app repository into my Ubuntu operating system. Now, what is an app repository? What is app repo in Ubuntu? Read about this, right? Spend some time reading things to understand what exactly is happening in the commands that you're running. So is a script that adds an external app repository to either this or that. So read into this. I don't really need to because I already know what all of this thing is. So I really hope you start reading more depending on what is showing up on your screen. So in this case, I'll simply add the Docker repo. Now this is where I'm actually telling Ubuntu that when I say apt-get install Docker, install it from download.docker.com and not from Canonical's Ubuntu repo, because this is where I will have the latest version of Docker, not the one that my operating system knows of right now. So I'll paste this command. Okay, then we'll run apt-get update and then we'll run apt-get install docker ce. So apt-get update, and if you want to run a couple of commands, you don't really have to type them individually. You can simply use a semicolon and add the second command. So then I'll say apt-get install y docker ce. So this will run apt-get update and it will install docker ce after the update is done. I hope we are all clear so far, right, guys? Are there any questions? Venkata says, is container installed on Docker? No, Venkata, there is no container installed on Docker. Docker itself is an engine using which you can actually create containers and such. So it will make more sense once we actually run a couple of containers. Okay. Nadeem says, is there any other way to install it on Mac? So Nadeem, you can simply look for Mac. In Mac, you can simply, if you're using brew, you can simply say brew install docker c, and that would also work. But in that case, you also have an app that you can install directly on a Mac, right? So look into this. The commands would always stay the same. So if you follow this and if you install Mac, I'm sorry, if you install Docker on Mac, once that is installed, this is where it will show up in this circular where they are showing this. And then comes the command part, and the command would always be the same. No matter where you are installing it, you might be installing it on Docker, on Linux, Windows, or Mac. The commands would always remain the same. Now, somebody asked me, how do you install it on Windows? So all you have to do is this. You will get a binary to install Docker on Windows. So Docker for Windows is a Docker Community Edition app. Now, if you go here, it says not found. Wow, interesting. For Windows, install package includes everything you need to run it on a Windows server, on a Windows system. So where is the Windows package? Download Docker for Windows. If you've not already done so, please install Docker for Windows. You can download installers from Stable or Edge channels. So where are the channels? Right, so Stable and Edge. So Stable is the best channel to use if you want a reliable platform. So it's the Stable version. This is more of the experimental version. So you can click on this and get Docker for Windows. Now this would be the simple, next, I agree, install and all of that. Once that is done, once you open Docker, the commands would be exactly the same as what I'm typing here. Nadeem says, okay, I did the same. It will get the latest version on. Yes, Nadeem, it will. Cool. I hope that answers your question as well, Ramesh. All right, now that I have Docker installed, let's just make sure that I actually do have Docker installed, right? So I can say Docker version, and it says I have Docker 1809.6 installed. So now that we know that Docker is, installed as a fact. Now let's start with a few basic commands of Docker and we'll build on top of it. So I said you can run containers, right? Now before we actually start with the commands, let's just talk about one more thing. Now there is something called as Docker container, and there is something called as a Docker image. Now you can think of this similar to what we have in a virtual machine and a virtual machine image. So virtual machine image, it's the packaged operating system, or it's just a snapshot. You can think of it like a snapshot that can be used to create a virtual machine. So in case of Edureka, now for the guys that have never worked on virtual machine, right? You can also do this. Edureka also offers you some virtual machine images, which has Docker and all of that pre-installed. And there is also a tutorial in your LMS on how to use that image to create a virtual machine. So follow that tutorial, even though you're not going to be using virtual machine for Jenkins and whatever we are doing here, but just follow that just to make sure you know what a virtual machine looks like. And once you've done that, you would know what an image is. An image is basically just a packaged or a snapshot of an operating system that you can use to create a new virtual machine. Similarly, you also have something called as a Docker image that can be used to create a Docker container. So Docker container is the actual server-like entity, while this Docker image is just a snapshot. It's just a copy of how I wanted my Docker container to be. So I can use this snapshot to create as many containers as I want. I can create 10 containers or 1,000 containers or just one container. Similar to how I have a virtual machine image and I can create 1,000 VMs out of it, or I can only create one VM out of it, as many as I want. Yes, Nadeem, it's like an ISO file. Like how you have ISO for a VM, the same way you have a Docker image that can be used to create a Docker container. Cool. So there are two parts of it. There is an image and there is a container. So image is a snapshot and container is the actual system where your application would be live. So now let's start with commands. Now at this point, Nadeem will talk about that in a while. So now at this point, now that I know my Docker is installed, what I want to do is I want to first check, do I have any containers up and running or not? I just want to get a list of containers, right? So that's the very basic thing I want to do. Now to get a list of containers that you have, you can run the command docker ps. Now ps will give you a list of any containers that you have. Now it is looking all screwed up because I'm completely zoomed into my shell. If I zoom out a little, You might not be able to read it properly, but if we wanted to see it, this is what it looks like. So in this case, you have container ID, image, command, created on, status, ports, and names. But in this case, it is blank because I obviously don't have any container running right now. But when you use the command docker ps, it's only going to show you the containers that are running. But if you want a complete list of containers, even if they are stopped or shut down or not working, you can use the command docker ps-a, which will list all the containers, even if they are stopped. So in this case, I don't have any containers. There are no stopped containers, there are no running containers, none at all. So I can use the command docker ps docker psa to list all the containers that I have. Then I can use the command docker images to view the images that I have in this system. Now, currently, I also don't have any image that I can make use of. Now, actually, let's get started with Docker. What I want to do is, let's say for now, I simply want to create an Ubuntu Docker container. We are already on Ubuntu, right? So let's just say I want to create a CentOS Docker container or any Red Hat based Docker container, right? So now there is a website called hub.docker.com, which is similar to how we have GitHub for Git. This is similar to that. The Docker Hub is for Docker. Now, Docker Hub, you will find images of almost everything that you can think of. So almost every company out there, right? They are also building the images of their application. So if you were looking for an image of a CentOS operating system, you can type CentOS, search for it, and you will see CentOS. And pay attention to this part. Where you see this official image, you can rest assured that this image is actually built by the real CentOS team and not by anybody else, because there are also images that are built by people like you and me. So this is more like a community where people build the images that they think will be useful for other people. Now, if you look at the second image, it says it has CentOS and PostgreSQL 96 on CentOS 7. So PostgreSQL is an advanced database management system. So if anybody has ever worked with a NoSQL database, they know what Postgre is. But the point is, if I use this image, I will end up with CentOS and Postgre databases installed on it. If I use the third image, if I scroll down, you see it says CentOS with PHP 5.6. So if you directly needed a CentOS operating system with PHP 5.6, you can use this image. But in this case, we are just going to stick to the official image and we will click on CentOS. Now, what I have to do is I have to first copy this image into my server so that I can create a container out of it. Now, it clearly tells me that if you want this image, you can simply run the command docker pull CentOS because the name of the image is CentOS. So I'll go back to my server and I'll say docker pull CentOS. Now, if you look at this, it says using the default tag latest pulling from library CentOS. So now it's pulling the image. If you also look at this, you can tell that this image is the size of the image is 75 megabytes. Now, if any one of you has ever installed CentOS on a virtual machine, I know for a fact that the size of a virtual machine is about 3 to 4 gigabytes. So in this case, I'm already reduced to 75 megabytes from 3000 to 3500 megabytes. So that's me already saving a lot of disk space for now. At this point, it says the image has been downloaded. So let's list the images again and see if I indeed have the CentOS image. Now you can see I have one image in this list. I'm sorry, it's 200 megabytes. It's not 75. So I have one image in this list. I have an image called CentOS. The tag is latest. Don't worry about what the tag is. We'll talk about that later. Then there is an image ID, and this particular image was created 2 months ago, and size of the image is 200 megabytes. Now I can actually start creating any number of containers using this image. But right before we create a container, I think it's time for us to take a short break. And once we get back, we will actually create the container using the image that we have, and we'll see what a proper container looks like. Cool. So at this point, we'll take a 10 minutes break. Once we get back, we will continue from where we left off. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. So, I have a couple of questions right before we proceed with Docker containers. Nadeem says, as you said, we can deploy any applications in a container. Why do we need to create containers, or why Docker Hub is maintaining images for Ubuntu, CentOS, and other operating systems? Now, that's a very good question, Nadeem. Let me answer that for you. Now, in our example, we have a .war file which was generated from a Java application because all the Java applications would have a .war file. Now, .war file or any Java application would require a web server such as Tomcat to actually run the application, right? Now, in that case, I also have an image of Tomcat available so that you will have. So, the idea is you create a container and you configure your application within the container, and then you take a snapshot or an image of it so that you can use that image to deploy as many containers of your application as you want. Now, in this case, because we are still introducing ourselves to the container, I'm just using a CentOS container so that we can kind of get a feel of what a container looks like. We will actually talk about how to deploy an application within a container after a while. Now, Mayur says, my Docker commands are only working using sudo. Without sudo, I'm getting permission errors. Now, yes, Mayur, what happens is when you install Docker, technically, technically, sorry, technically, there is a group that is created called Docker. Now, any user who's part of this Docker group that will have access to the Docker commands. Now, by default, it's only root user who can access the commands. So either your user that you are logged in as would have to be a part of Docker group, or you would have to use the root user, or you would have to use the sudo commands to run the Docker commands. That's the technical reason. Cool. Now, at this point in time, if I go back to Docker images, we know for a fact that I have a CentOS image created. So let's see how actually would you create a Docker container out of the image that you have. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'll run the command docker run. Now, see, there are very few Docker commands. The commands are not really difficult. I've said that multiple times. There are hardly 8 to 10 commands that you would be working with. So you have Docker images to list the images, you have Docker run to actually create a container, Docker start, Docker stop, Docker restart. We will look at all of those commands. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the commands are really simple. The complicated part is to understand the concept of how Docker can help your application become independent. But for now, we are not really talking about the application as such. We are just trying to understand how the container works. So I'm going to use my CentOS image to create a container. So I'll say docker run, I'll say -itd. Don't worry about what the -itd is. We will talk about this in a short while. I'll say docker run to create a container, and then you have to provide it with the name of the image that you want to use to create a container. So I'll say docker run -itd, and this is the image that you want to use. Now this will work because I have an image called CentOS in my system. So the moment I do it, I get a randomized string here, and this is the hash of your Docker container that has been created. So every Docker container would have a hash generated for it. Now, I told you the container is created, right? But we want to verify if the container is actually created or not, don't we? So in that case, I can go ahead and say docker ps to list. I'll zoom out if you find this output a little confusing. So if I zoom out and if I say docker ps, you can see I have a container ID, which is this. I have the name of the image that is used to create the container, which is this. Then the command would basically mean what is this container running. Now this container is simply running a shell. So it's running bash. This container was created 32 seconds ago. It has been up for 31 seconds. Now this should tell you it was created 32 seconds ago and it's been up for 31 seconds. So it literally took me 1 second. Technically, it was even less than a second. It literally took me 1 second to bring up a container using an image. Now the ports are blank because I did not really expose any ports at this point. And there is a name of the container, which is uh, confident eagle bark. So there is always a randomized name applied or assigned to each and every container that you create. There is a way to assign a specific name to the container, but we'll talk about that in a short while. Now, I told you